Good morning, everybody. We're extremely pleased with the level of interest in this particular meeting. As I think you all know, it's very kind of media orientated, and the basic idea is to give journalists and others, including of course parliamentarians, a chance to have a conversation with some of the folk who attended who participated in the Panorama programme last night. Okay, so that's kind of the background pretty much dealt with. In terms of who we have with us that was in the programme, there's myself, obviously. There's Mahendra Bajaj, who's with us today. Thank you, Mahendra, for being here. There's Paul and James Stevens. Thank you for being with us. There's Mr. Paul Carlier, who featured quite prominently in the programme yesterday. And I think that is everybody I can see that was in the programme. You all know, I think, about me in the Transparency Task Force, so I won't spend any time talking about that. What I am going to do is pass to Mark Bishop. For those of you that don't know, Mark is a very established and significant member of the Transparency Task Force community. Mark is going to be talking to the question, what could parliamentarians do now? And he's going to set out as clearly and as straightforwardly and as succinctly as possible the policy for reform initiatives that we've been thinking about and working on for the last couple of months, really, ever since the Financial Services and Markets Bill was announced. So Mark, if I can invite you please to pick up from there. After Mark's done his bit, I'll ask Paul Carlier to share any further thoughts he has on the programme and other points of interest off the back of it, and then we'll kind of open it up to Q&A and invite everybody that wants to ask questions of the participants, etc. I hope that's all okay. Let's try and cram as much as we can in until 11 o'clock. We may go over that. If you want to stay around for a while afterwards, that's absolutely fine, but let's go straight to Mark Bishop now. Thank you, Mark.
Okay, thank you, Andy. So I hope that the overriding feeling of most people who watched that programme last night was the FCA dropped the ball pretty badly. A load of consumers, innocent and deserving individuals, have lost money as a result. Therefore, the FCA should compensate those people. It's not a difficult train of logic. The problem is that as things stand, there is no mechanism by which this can happen. So in financial services legislation, the FCA since the year 2000 has been, and the SA before it, has been granted broad exemption from civil liability. The reason that was done, interestingly, by parliamentarians was not because they wanted the FCA or FSA to be unaccountable. It was that they wanted to save consumers the expense of litigation. So instead, they created an obligation on the regulators to have a complaint scheme. They never envisaged that because they'd also allowed the regulators the right to write the complaint scheme, and they made the recommendations of it non-obligatory, actually the FCA could get away with not paying redress by excluding regulatory failure from the complaint scheme, and when the Complaints Commissioner finds it anyway, deciding not to pay out, as they did with London Capital and Finance. So effectively, there could have been two routes to redress, and in fact, there are none. Now, as we know, the Blackmore bond investors lost some £46 million. It's unlikely there will ever be material recoveries, but they are only one case. It's been estimated that around £1 billion a year has been lost to financial investment scams alone in recent times, and the list of them is long and inglorious. There is obviously a systemic problem. So we think that the existence of the Financial Services and Markets Bill, the first for 22 years, is a great opportunity through amendment to change this situation. There are two ways it can be done. The first is to remove the FCA's broad exemption from civil liability. Why should it be above the law? And the second one is to mandate that its compensation scheme must deal with the issue of redress for regulatory failure, and that recommended awards by the Complaints Commissioner become mandatory on the regulators. So those are two things that would deal with the issue of financial redress, not just for the Blackmore bond investors, but for many others. Second thing is, this problem of it being systemic clearly means that there are concerns of the leadership, operation and governance of the FCA. The bill as currently drafted actually will make the situation worse. because currently the FCA is required to be mindful of representations made by 3 industry panels and 1 consumer panel. I should say the consumer panel contains people appointed by the FCA who tend not to be critical of the FCA. But that is the imbalance that exists. And there are now going to be 3 more panels, all of them kind of industry. Well, 2 of them industry and 1 of them about cost benefit analysis, which largely probably will mean consultants who work for the industry. So there is an imbalance there. There is a lack of the consumer voice and of consumers having any say in how the regulator is operated. In years gone by, 2 of the non-executive directors were appointed by the National Consumer Council. When that was abolished, that role went back to business department instead. So they're all kind of essentially corporates. So there is a governance challenge. In Australia, they found a solution. Because of problems in their financial services industry, they ran a Royal Commission, and one of its core recommendations was to create an oversight body called the Financial Regulators Assessment Authority. And we believe something similar is needed in the UK. And again, an amendment could easily deal with this matter. The third thing that we think needs to be done is to create a statutory duty of care to be owed by authorised firms to consumers. Now, those of you who watch parliamentary matters, and we have certainly 2 peers and representatives, I believe, of some MPs on this call, you will know that some very good and brave people amended the Financial Services Bill, as it was 2021, to include an obligation on the FCA to consult about and then bring forward rules about a duty of care. Now, the FCA didn't like that very much, so what it did was basically ignored it. It instead consulted on a thing called the consumer duty, which is a very different thing in law than a duty of care. And it has indeed brought forward rules about such a thing. It is materially inferior to a duty of care, and obviously parliamentarians wanted there to be a duty of care. So here is another opportunity whereby instead of trusting the FCA to get on with it, they can instead impose the thing. I think personally, in terms of the balance of power between our elected representatives and those who should serve us, actually, if it's not done, those who should be serving us will think that they are our masters, because they will have got away with effectively gaming an obligation placed on them by our parliament. And that is a very serious abrogation of how things should operate in this country. So those are effectively 3 proposals. First one, FCA liable for errors, and its complaint scheme deals with regulatory failure. And that gets money into the hands of the victims, and it does so relatively quickly. The second one is reform the governance of the FCA, so it hears the voice of the consumer more and the voice of the industry and the Treasury a little less. Third thing is a duty of care to be owed by authorised firms. And you might think that's an abstract thing, but actually it matters very much in the context of Blackmore Bond alone. Because, as I'm sure you know, there are certain activities that have to be undertaken by a regulated or authorised firm, even if it's a supposedly unregulated activity or product. So, for example, the promotional material had to be approved by an authorised firm. An authorised firm was the insurance broker that provided the insurance policy that led to the guarantee, which proved to be worthless. And that brokers, or the brokers, are based in the UK. Now, there is no contractual relationship between, Mahendra, Jane, Paul, the investors in Blackmore Bond. There's no contractual relationship between them and the insurance broker or the authorised firm that approved the dodgy promotions. So there isn't a right for them to sue at the moment. But if there was a duty of care, there would be such a right. They would be empowered to say to those people, you failed to avoid a reasonably foreseeable harm caused to me. These are my losses, please pay me. So those are the overall points, the 3 points that we want to encourage parliamentarians to reflect in amendments to this forthcoming bill. And we will also be encouraging investors in Blackmore Bond, people who invested in other failed regulatory failure cases, and people who are concerned citizens, all to write to their MPs, making the case for them to back these amendments. Thank you very much indeed. Andy, over to you.
Mark, thank you very much indeed for setting that out so clearly. I'm going to throw in a couple of dates now. 7th of September. The 7th of September is significant because that's the next reading of the Financial Services and Markets Bill. We're going to be watching that like a hawk. We would really encourage all of the journalists who are on the call today, in the meeting today, to pay close attention to that, because this is more than just any other normal financial services bill. Because of Brexit, there is effectively an opportunity to rewrite all these rules. So there could be some profoundly significant changes that will be occurring in Parliament off the back of this bill. So 7th of September, please tune into that and cover it and write about it, because it's really, really important stuff. The second date I'm going to mention is the 15th of September. We, the TTF, have organised a meeting in Parliament on the 15th of September for parliamentarians and other key stakeholders, which can include members of the press. Let me know if you'd like to come to that. The purpose of that conversation is to talk about the sorts of reforms that we are discussing today, and to get opinions about them and to absorb other ideas from other people as well. So 7th of September is important, and 15th of September is important as well. I'll now be passing shortly to Paul Carlier. After that, we'd love to hear reflections and reactions to the programme from Baroness Kramer and from Baroness Bennett, and then I'll try to manage a Q&A as best as I can. And hopefully we'll have a constructive time together until 11 o'clock. We can go on a little bit after that if you want to, but let's try to aim for 10 o'clock. Mr. Carlier, over to you, sir. Thank you.
Hi. Yeah, I just want to really obviously agree with the things that Mark said. As much as this shines a damning spotlight on what happened in Blackmore Bond, it's not an isolated case. And as much focus needs to be on preventing this happening again. We've had multiple lessons learned exercises, and it's clear that the lessons don't get learned. So I think what Mark's proposing and the TTF is proposing to do is a very sensible approach, but that doesn't lessen the call in this case that there should be compensation for investors. The bottom line is the FCA had the opportunity to act and failed to. And I want to address that position that the FCA has put forward again, and they put it forward in the programme, that everything about Blackmore Bond was beyond the perimeter authority and powers, because it frankly wasn't. One of the key things that I reported in March 17 was that they were targeting pensioners and they were manipulating the sophistication of these individuals. Now, under FSMA and FCA COBS, it is prohibited in the UK for any firm to sell non-regulated investment products to non-sophisticated customers. It is as clear as can be. And the FCA seeks to try and imply that that only applies if it was regulated firms doing it. That's a nonsense, because the whole purpose of the regulation and the law in the first place is to prevent cowboys from doing it and forcing them to get regulated in order to do it. Therefore, somebody that's doing this without getting regulation or authorization is much more within the FCA's perimeter, because they're seeking to circumvent the laws. So, it's quite clear that that's what they were doing. They were manipulating sophistication. I also want to refer you to the fact that the FCA's sole justification or response on this was that investors ticked a box to say that they understood the risks. Whereas the FCA themselves in 2016 essentially outlawed or prohibited the act of ticking the box as being an acceptable way of demonstrating or self-certifying sophistication. Firms were obliged to undertake due diligence and further assessment so as to confirm that these people were sophisticated as claimed. In other words, the FCA has referred to and relied upon something that it itself prohibited 6 years ago. It's a complete nonsense. And that kind of brings me to another report that was made to Mark Stewart personally in March 2018 by an IFA, himself authorised and regulated, and he pointed out the various failures, the manipulation, sophistication, the history of Nunn and McCreish, and he also highlighted the powers that the FCA had to act. And based upon those 2016 changes, they had the power to go into Blackmore Bond and demand that they prove all of the steps they undertook to validate the sophistication of their customers. Had they done so, they could have shut it down within a month and put a stop to it. The other issue as well is that in Dame Gloucester's report, she made the point of manipulation and sophistication, and the FCA accepted that this was a problem, and it was but they defended it. Oh, it's very difficult to identify, and it's even harder to investigate. nonsense. I gave them the opportunity. I told them where we were, that we were separated by a glass partition. We could see and hear everything. All they had to do is send someone down, set up shop in our office for a week, and they would have had the best real-time intelligence they're probably ever likely to have. And yet they made no effort to do so, made no effort to contact me, but at the same time assured me they were escalating up the food chain. And let's look at that. I did an FOI to to the FCA this year, and Mark Stewart himself replied. My FOI was, what is the FCA's protocol if a reporter comes to you with, or somebody reports conduct or actions that falls outside of your perimeter? Stewart himself wrote that we would therefore refer that matter to the relevant body or agency, and they would signpost the person reporting that matter to that other relevant body or agency. In March 17, August 2018 and August 2019, when I made these reports, the FCA never once signposted me elsewhere. So therefore, it was they knew full well it was very much within their perimeter. Furthermore, in August 18, Mark Stewart personally replies, we are making inquiries. In August 19, a full year later, when I challenged them again for having found this firm still operating, he says this is part of our ongoing work. That's a book. There are two bookends there of at least 1 year apart, where it shows that there was a period of a 1 year at least investigation being undertaken by the FCA. It would have taken half an hour to determine that Blackmore Bond and people involved weren't regulated, and but they spent a year investigating it. Why? Because they knew that the conduct being reported fell within their perimeter. So any representation the FCA had made or continues to make to the contrary, false. The problem the FCA had, in my opinion, was in April 2020 when it collapsed. Mike O'Dwyer of the Telegraph produced an article and referred to these failures, and the FCA panicked into a response and said exactly that. It was all beyond our perimeter authority and powers. Having committed to that, they've then kind of put themselves in a corner where they can't go back on that, because then that would prove that they lied in the first instance. And herein lies a problem with the FCA. Failures or dishonesty in the past then predetermines how they must act in the future, and that is never a good outcome for consumers. I also want to address, the FCA said that in the programme that they reported Blackmore Bond to City of London Police in 2017. Well, I did a Freedom of Information request to City of London Police last year, and City of London Police wrote back to say that there were 70 reports that was received by them on action fraud in respect to Blackmore Bond between 2016 and 2021. And the City of London Police also confirmed that none of them came from the FCA. So either City of London Police is lying or the FCA is lying, but basically one contradicts the other. So, draw from that what you will. And I've got the Freedom of Information response from City of London Police if anyone wants access to it. And following on from that statement that they reported it to the City of London Police in 2017, they also said that, implied that at the same time they shut down the marketing website and took a proactive step. They didn't take that step until 2019. So, again, there's an implication that they acted when the only time they actually acted was when the horse had long bolted and way after the event. So, and in expanding upon the City of London Police issue, we've got multiple responses that people have shared with us that show the response that they received from the National Fraud Intelligence Bureau in response to their action fraud report. And every victim that reported Blackmore Bond to action fraud got an identical response from the NFIB, the National Fraud Intelligence Bureau, and it said that we review all these reports and to try and identify any lines of inquiry, but we can confirm in this situation, I'll quote it verbatim, it has not been possible to identify a line of inquiry which a law enforcement organisation in the United Kingdom could pursue. Now, this is disturbing in the sense that it's false, because the NFIB knew that Blackmore Bond directors Nunn and McCreish were under investigation by the SFO for their role in the Capita Oak pension scam, a scam that in which they are alleged to have received £600,000 in commissions for bringing in people into that scam. And also, Surge Financial are also under investigation by the SFO for their role in the LCNF fraud. Surge were paid £40 million by LCNF for bringing people into that scheme. The Blackmore Bond records clearly show that Surge were paid £7 million by Blackmore Bond in 2017 for doing the same. So how does the NFIB actually confirm that there are no lines of inquiry? We're not talking about here evidence to prove guilt. We're talking about lines of inquiry. These are two clear and unequivocal lines of inquiry that the NFIB, City of London Police, absolutely knew existed, and yet told investors there were no lines of inquiry, made no effort to obtain their evidence or testimony. And it was only when I made my own report in April last year and basically dumped my evidence on City of London Police, giving them nowhere to go, and before they could come back with such a response, that they then eventually confirmed that they had discussed with various other bodies and decided that the Insolvency Service should investigate this, and an investigation began. So again, it appears much more that seeking to pass the buck. So yeah, exactly. The NFIB, they're then responsible for nonsense, and if City of London Police were aware, then investors wouldn't have got such a response. I just want to make it clear as well that the Panorama programme was only able to sort of touch on what is the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more to this than that they could put in the programme. Just before I move on to that, I just want to point out to highlight the FCA's position about the beyond their perimeter. You'll be aware perhaps that of an airport car park investment scam that collapsed, and the FCA is taking action against those involved in that. And just for the record, not one of the parties involved or persons involved FCA regulated, yet the FCA is intervening and acting. Equally, in 2018, the FCA secured 5 fraud convictions against individuals for running an investment scam. I think it was £28 million was lost in that. None of the individuals or companies that were involved in that scam were authorised or regulated. But the FCA intervened, secured 5 fraud prosecutions, and ironically, in a press release on that, Mark Stewart himself said, these fraudsters callously targeted investors who were often elderly and vulnerable, exactly as I'd reported to the FCA in March 2017. But it proves again that, and Mark Stewart himself said that in that same press release, the FCA again reminds consumers not to invest in schemes being offered by firms that are not authorised by the FCA and look too good to be true, like these ones, and before it inevitably collapsed. So the FCA and Stewart are confirming they're aware that if it looks too good to be true, it will inevitably collapse. So, and yet in 2017, everything I put to them, they failed to lift a finger and do anything. Now, as I mentioned, there was another point in the programme was that the FCA was shown a copy of the letter where their investigator had written, I consider that we missed an opportunity to act on your intelligence, and then it was crossed out. The FCA put forward a reason for that new evidence came, or new information or evidence came to light after that was written, and that was the reason it was crossed out. That is nonsense, and the reason being is that the investigator that wrote it in October 2020. That was 3 years, 3.5 years after my initial reports, and he'd spent a year investigating my complaint that was made in September 2019. So he spent a year investigating it. He had access to every piece of information that the FCA held on this, and having reviewed all that and investigated for a year, that was his conclusion. We missed an opportunity to act on your intelligence. And he made that reference in respect to my reports in March 17, and again in respect to the reports I made in August 2018. There is no possible information or evidence that could have come to light after that date to warrant changing that conclusion. What possible information could have come to light that changed the conclusion from we missed an opportunity to act on your intelligence to one of essentially what they're trying to claim, we didn't miss an opportunity to act on your intelligence. Now, the bottom line is the guys investigators produced an outcome. It wasn't an outcome that was consistent with the desired narrative of the FCA. And this guy was then hauled off the case and replaced with somebody else. And he would then send me a response a year later that contradicted much of what was in that first response. And as I say, I've got both responses if anyone wants access to those. One other thing, and before I move on, is that what didn't come across in the programme, because they didn't really have time, was that you will see John Robbins featured in the RAF veteran. He featured in the programme. Now, John didn't invest in Blackmore bonds initially. He invested in another Nunn & McCreesh project called Blackmore Estates. And it was when his investment in that was maturing, an investment that also had guarantees as to income, that he was invited to invest in Blackmore bonds. And in the end, he wasn't just invited, he was forced into it. They did the transfer themselves. Nunn & McCreesh transferred his investment into that, or so they claimed. So they claimed that they transferred £20,000, his principal investment, £20,000, plus the £4,000 interest into Blackmore bond. The liquidators Kroll confirmed that the company records show this investment being made on and around that date. And when we asked Kroll to confirm, was there a transfer of cash or assets equivalent to that value on or around those dates, Kroll, it took them quite a while to confirm. I sense they were reluctant to do it, but they confirmed that there was no transfer of cash to the Blackmore bond accounts, in respect to that amount or around that time in favour of John, and there was similarly no transfer of assets or anything to that value. So what you have there is evidence of a Ponzi scheme, and John wasn't the only one. And another investor that was invested in Blackmore bond in 2017, she was likewise transferred in. And in both cases, they never transferred the money out to the individual for them to reinvest. It was transferred in. And again, it's another example. This is a classic Ponzi flag. You've got these amazing investments that are promising all this stuff. When they mature, you've got a problem. How are you going to repay them when clearly you haven't generated the returns that you said? Well, you don't. You find a way not to. And the way you do that is create another vehicle that sounds even more incredible, and then you offer to transfer people into it, as well as attracting new investors in as well. So these, and again, and that transfer, the liquidator had to confirm that there was no transfer of cash or assets into Blackmore to of the value that was being put in by this vet. There was literally no transfer at all in that person's name, no cash credit or anything. Again, it's a classic Ponzi scheme sign, and that was really being suppressed, we got the impression, and wasn't coming out. Now, as you would have found in the programme, roughly a third of the investment turns out end up being paid in fees and commissions to various parties, be it Surge, be it Amima, be it the Gibraltar-based company, you know, it went a third of the money. However, what has yet to be established is how much of the remainder, the 2/3 remainder, was actually phantom or bogus investment in from these other schemes. And I don't necessarily think it was just from Blackmore Estates. The more you dig into this, there's a whole circular network of people. How many were transferred in from other bogus schemes by other people? There's a whole other issue here that wasn't touched upon in the programme because they didn't have time. Not that said, I can't say to Luke, the producer, and the team, I can't express my gratitude highly enough in terms of how they presented that program, the narrative, and importantly, not only hit upon the real key issues here, the sophistication thing, but they also got across the real human impact of this this failure. Because when we all hear about numbers and everything else, it tends to lose sight of the actual personal impact. I think I actually heard one person say, "Well, it was only 48 million. LCNF was 200 million." Only. Where did that come into the narrative? Only 48 million. So yeah, so basically, great job, guys, and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much indeed, Paul. Thank you so much. For those of you that don't know, I mean, Paul, Carlier, Mark Bishop, Mahendra, many other people have been putting in an extremely significant amount of time and effort on a purely unpaid voluntary basis to trying to bring about the changes that are necessary, and we were just absolutely delighted with the quality of the program. We're just blown away by it. We've had so much really positive feedback. I mentioned in the chat that we're so pleased that Luke Mendham's here, because Luke is the producer of 9 Lives Media, the programme producers, the people that made the programme last night. Can we please, for my sake, show our appreciation to Luke, because if it wasn't for the work of him and his team, the programme would never have happened, and those poor victims of Blackpool Bond would never have had the publicity that's hopefully going to make a real difference. So, Mr. Mendham, well done. We salute you, sir. We really do. I think you've done a great job. Thanks ever so much.
That's very nice. Can I just say, we really just followed the work that was being done, and it's you guys, no, literally, and the people who very bravely told their stories, having lost their money, which is not an easy thing to do.
Yeah.
And that's the basis of the film. So we just put it together. But thank you very much for that.
Thanks, Luke. Thanks, Luke. Let's now go to Baroness Kramer, somebody who I've learnt to really admire over the last 3 or maybe 4 years for her knowledge and her tenacity in driving reforms through Parliament for the benefit of society as a whole. Baroness Kramer, Susan Kramer, please share with us your thoughts about the programme last night, and of course, anything else you'd like to say or ask. The floor's yours. Thank you.
Well, I mean, the programme was absolutely brilliant, and I want to join in the congratulations to Luke and his team, because this is something that easily could have looked dry and you could have seen people turn off very quickly, and instead it was utterly gripping. So I think that was as gripping as any piece of fiction where people could play as they wished with the drama. And the courage of all the folk who spoke up, and the clarity and the honesty. So I thought that was just an exceptional programme yesterday. And I'm hoping very much as a consequence it has real impact. I just wanted to follow, just to say that, see if you think that I've got my head in the right place here, which is there really seem to be 2 streams of action that need to happen. One is to get a judge-led inquiry, because that's going to be the only way to pull together, I think, all the strands of inaction by the FCA and the various other regulators, the people who couldn't intervene, and create the pressure for compensation for the people who were scammed, with essentially a regulator standing on the sidelines and ignoring a situation when they should have been fully engaged. So I think that is crucially important. The second is dealing with the Financial Services and Markets Bill. It's huge. I have to confess, I'm putting aside most of next week to read it line by line. It's a nightmare, but it will start in the Commons and not in the Lords. And you raised 3 essentials that are to get amended into this bill, all of which I agree with, by the way, but I thought I might give you a bit of background on some of them. If I start with the statutory duty of care, which I think for all of us is absolutely fundamental, that not just to deal with this issue, but with so many other, but just with the whole culture of financial services today, and they're set in proper statutory responsibilities. We've got a good history of well-crafted amendments to deal with those issues. At some point, we need to discuss strategy, because with the 21 bill, we made the call that trying to force the appropriate amendments in at the common stage would lead to an automatic, we would lose them, because we couldn't rely on a majority in the Commons, since the government has 80 votes in its back pocket. And so it had to be fairly carefully crafted to leave scope for an amendment that would come in the Lords, which can never mirror a lost amendment in the Commons. I can't remember if that's actually just convention, but in a practical sense, if something's been lost in the Commons and you try and bring in the mirror image in the Lords, it will never get through. And there was a lot of work, my colleague John Sharkey very involved in this, in trying to find a roundabout route to both be within scope, that's not overlap with the wording be used in the Commons, and it was passed, and would have led to a duty of care. But I think there's a lot of understanding on how to do that one. On the inadequacies of or the Australian example of an oversight body, so that was pushed also in that same piece of legislation, with amendments crafted by my colleague Sharon Bowles, who is really understands every line and detail, has long been very interested in the Australian approach and the creation of an oversight body, which has much greater consequences. We now have a regulator who, post-Brexit, that has received powers that, when they were at European level, were very heavily scrutinised. There was constant challenge, there was constant scrutiny, there had to be constant reports back that to the various different features of the European Parliament. All of that disappeared. The whole thing is handed directly off to the FCA, and there is no parliamentary oversight mechanism other than things like Treasury Committee and whatever else, who, you know, could address an issue once, maybe every 5 years in a 1-hour meeting with 6 other issues involved, etc. So that oversight body, but I think I'll try and get Sharon back involved around that issue. And then the issue of removing the FCA exemption from civil liability, and making sure that FCA compensation scheme that includes regulatory failure and on a mandatory basis, if that's the determined award. That anything that you have in terms of drafting around that, any specific points, any specific issues, if you can get them to us, so we probably don't need them at second reading, but we'll certainly need them by committee stage in the Commons, and definitely we'll need them in great detail in the Lords. Any drafting, any legal support, any thoughts you've got around those would be very, very useful indeed. So anything you can get us to help us shape amendments. I'm pretty confident we can do statutory duty of care. We've probably got some people who understand how to shape push for the oversight body, though again, additional thoughts would be most welcome. But we really need some help around, I think, getting the language right on the removing exemptions, the FCA exemption from civil liability and regulatory failure. And then anything that you can do to reach government ministers, because in the end, I suspect we can get most of this passed in the Lords, but it will be overturned when it returns to the Common. And the work that you've done in this programme will make that, is already beginning to make that more difficult.
Baroness Kramer, thank you so much. You've crammed a lot into a relatively short period of time there. It is, I can't begin to tell you what it's like for a campaign organisation like us, a bunch of, you know, free-thinking individuals who want change to happen. I can't tell you what it's like having people like yourself and Natalie Bennett and Martyn Day and Peter Grant and Kevin Holland-Rake and Lord Sharkey and Sharon Bowles and others wanting the same sorts of things that we want. We love the idea of working with you collaboratively. We're going to try to find some lawyers to help us on a pro bono basis in terms of, you know, initial drafting, etc., etc., etc. So please do think of us as a resource to tap into, and we'll engage and support everything you want to do as best as we possibly can. That was superb. We're going to go to Natalie Bennett next, and then we're going to go to Martyn Day, then we'll open things up. Natalie, your thoughts, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you everyone for being here today. I just want to echo what Baroness Kramer said about well done to the programme and all the producers and everyone who contributed. As a former newspaper editor, whilst I worked in print, I know a little bit about television and how hard it can be to make financial stories that don't innately have lots of lovely pictures with them, excuse me, to fill that much space. It was spectacularly well done. Just to set out my personal stall on this, I'm afraid I won't be able to pick up the next financial services bill in the Commons, because while Baroness Kramer is looking at it next week, I'm looking at the similar length and similar complexity energy bill next week, which is starting in the Lords. But certainly I will be very happy to pick up and do whatever I can once the bill, if indeed we get that far, if the bill gets to the Lords. Just a couple of thoughts. I very much agree. I think the duty of care, I did a lot of work on it on the last bill round, and I think it's something that's immediately comprehensible. which kind of brings me to a broader point, is I think there is a real problem with financial services legislation, that people feel like it's a specialist thing that's to be left to a few specialists in the House. And actually, I mean, the last bill, I was still relatively new to the House when it came through. And one of the things that really deeply shocked me was how few peers there were who were engaged in it. The number of people engaged very often was absolutely tiny. You know, quite a lot of groups of amendments. There was literally only two front bench opposition speakers, the minister and one or two others, if that, in addition to one of the proposers. And so what I really think we can certainly do in the Lords, and maybe this is also true in the Commons, is try and get more people engaged. And I think Panorama is a really useful tool for that, of saying, you know, this affects ordinary people, and this is not just about highly technical stuff that, you know, if we're going to understand. This is about getting things working properly and thinking about how to get more people involved. In terms of the Lords, I'd point you to Lord Brown of Ladyton, Des Brown, former Defence Secretary in the Labour years. He had a very interesting debate, which you could find by looking up his name and oligarchs and autocrats. And there is increasing concern about the place of the financial sector in terms of supporting regimes around the world that are doing huge damage. There's increasing concern about corruption and its impact on the global south. And if you looked at the peers who were engaged in that debate, and it was a very good quality debate, very interesting, and a large amount of agreement that we have a huge problem widespread with corruption. I've always believed that campaign groups getting together where they have similar interests, and there's a lot of work, the anti-corruption people, the sort of, you know, even going through to people like War on Want and those sorts of organisations, getting together and collectively saying there's a real problem here. There's a problem at a sort of basic institutional level, the FCA, the way it's not working, the way the City of London police are not working, etc. But there is also an underlying deep corruption problem. The word enablers, I think, has very much become part of the language. And if we join these things up, campaign groups become much more powerful than if they're just operating on what seems to be a relatively narrow area of ground. So I think, you know, what I'd urge you to do as campaigning groups, and indeed I'd say to the media on this call too, is really branch out and make the links, join up the dots to see that, you know, this problem isn't just the nature of the FCA and the lack of people, the right people on advisory committees. All of those things are good things that can make things a bit better and maybe pick off a few of the most corrupt people around the edges. But we have a deep-seated corruption problem. And really, we need to tackle those. And there's lots of people interested in that. So bring that all together, and that will make the campaign much more powerful. Thanks very much.
Natalie, thank you very much indeed. Thank you very, very much indeed. We know, Natalie, that Kevin Holland-Rake and folks like Kevin Holland-Rake MP and folks like him are really keen to do work with the economic crime bill. And an idea coming from that is about, you know, improving the protections for whistleblowers, because the more protected the whistleblowers are, the more evidence we get, the quicker we can bang people up and get them out of a position where they can cause harm to society. Thank you very much indeed, Natalie. Great to have your input and engagement as always. Mr. Martyn Day MP. Martyn very kindly came to the Rally for Better regulation that we ran a couple of months ago. It was great to see Martyn there. Martyn, please, your thoughts. Thank you.
I watched the documentary last night, and I thought it was an excellent film. It got the message across in a way that was really, really understandable, but got the emotion and the turmoil that people have been affected by. I thought it was really well put together. Happy to work cross-party. I've, from my constituency experiences, I've been absolutely convinced that the FCA is just not fit for purpose and needs massive overhaul. There's just too many cases where people feel they're protected and they're blatantly not been, and they're left destitute effectively. So anything I can do, I'm happy to help where I can. I mean, obviously we go back in September. It might be worth even a number of us trying for an urgent question on the back of the documentary, just to try and get something up, you know. I suspect there'll be loads of issues that people will be trying for, so it'll be a bit of Russian roulette as to what can get called, but it's probably worth, if we don't ask, we won't get, so we might as well give it a go.
Yes, definitely.
That sounds like a great idea, a really, really good idea. Martyn, thank you very, very much. Martyn, anything else from you before we open things up to the journalists who are here today?
No, I was just very impressed when I watched last night, and I thought, yeah, this gets the message across really well, and
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Okay, we're going to go to the second part of this. We'll probably wrap up at about 11:15. Of course, if anybody needs to jump off at 11 o'clock, that's absolutely fine. We understand that. But I'll certainly be happy to keep the channel open till 15:15 for those of you that may want to be open until then. I've moved my screen view to gallery view, so I can see people putting their hands up if they want to come in with a question or a comment. Put your hand up either literally or digitally if you know how to do that. So do any of our journalists have any comments or questions that they'd like to put to the group, please? Thank you. Oh, Michael, could you please sort of talk your question through as opposed to putting it in?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Hi, how are you going? Thank you very much. Thanks a lot for this. Just, I know everyone's short time. Just one, could Mark Bishop please elaborate on the difference between the FCA's sort of current idea of a consumer duty policy and why it's weaker compared to his idea of a more beefed up statutory duty of care for authorised firms, please? If you could just, I thought that would be, because the and the reason for that question is that the FCA is making a lot of it's drawing a lot of attention to the forthcoming consumer duty, and a lot of people are saying that that will be the biggest shake-up for the financial advice space since the retail distribution review. So that's where that question comes from. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much indeed, Michael. And I think that's a sensible question and one that deserves the best answer I can give. And it's this: I'm not a lawyer, but a QC who helped us draft our response to the consumer duty consultation advised us that the term duty of care has a very specific meaning in law, and there's a case precedent that relates to it from, I think, about the 1920s. It means that it's an obligation on one party to avoid causing reasonably foreseeable harms to another party, breach of which gives rise to a civil claim under tort laws. So what that means in English is these people over here who are authorised persons, so they are firms and individuals who are on the FCA register, would be obliged to avoid causing reasonably foreseeable harm to consumers as defined by financial services legislation. So it would also include retail level SME, the bank with UK banks. So and if there was a breach, then there would be two ways of getting redress. The first is that the FCA would be empowered to come up with a redress scheme, such as under Section 404 of FSMA, or the Sections 382 to 4, the restitution order ones. The second is that the individual could go to court and sue, or a group of them together could sue. So that is what a duty of care is. Then we need to look at what is the consumer duty. The consumer duty is a set of expectations that the FCA now has of authorised firms, which it has set out in extensive detail. In some ways, I'm a cynic. I think what the FCA has done is actually very clever, almost sociopathically clever, because what they've done is they've created something that sounds many, many times more valuable and more powerful than a duty of care, because it's 121 pages instead of a paragraph. Of course, it's got to be better, hasn't it? But actually, there are two problems. The first problem is the only standard to which these firms are being held is that which is stated by the consumer duty. If it's not in the consumer duty, there is no obligation whatsoever. The second problem is that the only remedies are available as a result of FCA enforcement action. If the FCA chooses not to do anything, or not to do as much as consumers want, that's tough. Nothing consumers can do about it. The amazing thing about a duty of care, a genuine duty of care, is it empowers 65 million consumers and turns them into financial services regulators. And you might speculate the FCA doesn't want that, and you might wonder why the FCA doesn't want it. And the obvious reason is effectively what they will have done is created an open goal, and we can all start scoring penalties because the goal is empty and nobody's looking after it. There would be a huge liability for financial services firms until they got their act together. The FCA effectively is the gatekeeper that protects, or the goalkeeper that protects them from these claims. Now, it was suggested that this consumer duty could be accompanied by what's called a private right of action, which means that consumers could litigate. In the consultation, the vast majority of consumer responses, unsurprisingly, wanted this and the industry ones didn't. Guess which the FCA went with? The industry, of course. So it doesn't even have that power. But even if it did have that power, actually reading the 121 pages of the Consumer Duty, there are some very significant weaknesses. I'm going to talk about just one of those now, because it doesn't relate to Blackmore Bond and because it's a nice scoop for the journalists that are on the call. And I always think if you're a journalist and you bother to turn up to something when others don't, you deserve something. Okay, so it's this. You may know that we at Transparency Task Force provide the Secretariat for the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Personal Banking and Fairer Financial Services. In that capacity, we have been asked to investigate some correspondence that came into the offices of some of the MPs that are on that group. And it was about building societies. And the correspondence was mostly from very elderly and vulnerable people. And they said the following: a few years ago, we went into our building society to pay in a cheque or whatever, something that didn't really matter. And we were told by the staff that they were on some kind of drive to make sure that their customers all got wills. And they offered to introduce us to a company called the Will Writing Company. And we went along to a function, maybe after core opening hours in the building society, where there were people from this Will Writing Company, people from the building society, there were drinks, and we decided to go to them and get a will written. Those people then suggested that we might need a family trust, firstly to avoid inheritance tax, and secondly to avoid money being taken from our state as we get elderly and infirm to pay for care home fees. Actually, a trust would not prevent those things. There are anti-avoidance measures, but this was the pitch. So they would then spend some thousands of pounds getting a trust created. And unfortunately, what they then found out is sometimes this would create extra liabilities. And then it gets worse. The firm that ran the trust company claimed that it was having financial difficulties, and it transferred all of the clients to another company with a slightly different name. And now, of course, it's a few years down the line, these elderly people start dying. So their homes are sold and the money is invested by the trustees for the benefit of the beneficiaries of the trusts in some collective investment schemes that the perpetrators have created that involve lending money to tiny businesses that may or may not be connected to them and their friends. And these loans are now of uncertain value. Feels a lot like Blackmore Bonds, doesn't it? So you see how this has come full circle. Now, why have I told you this story? Partly because I want to give you a scoop about one of the next financial services scandals to make the point that these things are still ongoing. You know, Blackmore Bond is not the end, it's not the final chapter, it's just one of them. The second reason to make this point is that a building society is an authorised person. They are all on the FCA register. Many of them have been in existence since Victorian times. The duty of care doesn't say anywhere that an introduction to a third party made by a building society or any other regulated firm, if it goes horribly wrong, could be a liability for the building society. In fact, it explicitly says the reverse. It says if an authorised person introduces somebody to a third party. And it goes
you mean the Consumer Duty, Mark?
Yeah.
Yes, I apologise. Yes, sorry. The Consumer Duty makes no provision of this sort. So very specifically, it excludes liability for the actions of third parties. Whereas if a duty of care had come along, well, actually, a duty of care says avoid reasonably foreseeable harms. So if you introduce vulnerable elderly clients to a third party firm, having done little or no due diligence, that you have not traded with before in any way, you've got no idea of their track record, it happens that they are not regulated either by the Financial Services Financial Conduct Authority or the Solicitors Regulatory Authority. They're just amateurs. You don't know what, if any, professional indemnity cover they've got. You do nothing to monitor how that relationship continues thereafter, after the introduction. You take a fee for making this introduction, which you do not disclose to the customer, and things go horribly wrong. Well, I would argue that probably is a reasonably foreseeable harm. And if a duty of care existed, then that would mean that the building societies would have to compensate their clients. But under the Consumer Duty, it is very expressly excluded. So there is just one example, there are many others, of why the Consumer Duty is inferior in its scope. And of course, it's also inferior in its powers because only the FCA can use it, not the consumer. Thank you very much indeed. Any more questions, Michael, about that?
Could we contact you separately
Yes.
on that one to try and get
I'll put my email in.
Thanks. Just some more to get on that building.
Thank you, Mark. If you put your email in the chat, Paul, if you do the same, if anybody else who's involved with the programme would be happy to have the journalist contact them, then please do pop your email address into the chat. Great question, Mike, and superb answer, Mark. Thank you very much. Who's next in terms of questions, please? Agathangelou, lovely to see you, sir. Over to you. Please briefly introduce yourself and then put your point to us. Thank you.
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Agathangelou, and thanks very much for the brilliant work, Andy and team. It's really exceptional and mind-blowing. I work in financial services, so we've seen bits and pieces of this, but this scale, I've never thought or imagined that it could be to this level. A very quick question I thought I'd ask is from the outlook of the Panorama. It is very clear that these schemes are still going on as we speak, and there are various regulations that are meant to stop it. MiFID II investor protection is very clear on suitability and appropriateness of these kind of schemes, and I'm just thinking, is there a way to have like a place where people can report themselves on these kind of schemes, since the regulators are doing nothing about it?
The reason I'm laughing at it, Teresa, is I'm going to ask Mark Bishop to explain what he did to try to get the FCA to do something remarkably simple that would give people an opportunity to report ideas. You're not going to believe this, folks. Journalists, tune into what Mark's about to say. It is gospel true. Tune into this. All right, Mark, over to you.
So is this the thing about the Scam Smart?
Yes, yeah.
Okay. So you probably all know that the FCA has a campaign called Scam Smart. It says to people, here's how you can spot a potential financial scam. And that's all it does. We had a symposium at Transparency Task Force for our members, and we invited along the Chief Executive of the FCA, Nikhil Rati, and he brought along a couple of his senior team, including Sheldon Mills, who's in charge of competition and consumer. We talked about how the thing could be improved, the FCA could be improved, but unfortunately they left by the time the Q&A had finished and these slides came up. So I got into email correspondence with Sheldon Mills I was trying to propose the tiniest little idea that could improve Scam Smart. So this was, why not have a line at the end of the ad that says, if you think you've seen a scam, contact the FCA. Here's how to do it. Now, it seemed to me that there are three benefits to this. The first thing is the FCA would get a very early notification of some scams, which might not otherwise be the case. There's got to be some value in that, surely. The second thing is consumers would get additional protection because there would be a trail created of these contacts into the FCA much earlier about these scams. And if the FCA did nothing, then the FCA could be liable, at least morally. Now, of course, that would then create pressure on the FCA to act, and therefore that would be useful. We want the FCA to act. Third benefit actually comes straight out of Freakonomics, if you've ever read the Freakonomics series of books. And it's this: in America, one of the ways that police departments try to deter drug dealers from settling in certain places is they put up huge billboards that say, drug dealers, report your competition. And then there's a number. And what's brilliant about that, of course, is if you're a drug dealer there, you wouldn't want to be dealing drugs because you know that somebody else is going to come along and report you so they can take your slot. So actually, it's a great way of deterring drug dealers. Similarly, if the FCA turned the 65 million UK consumers into their eyes and ears, looking out for scams and notifying them immediately, even if we know that the FCA is useless, not all scammers know that yet, and they can't afford to take the risk. They would see it as a signal that the FCA has woken up and started to do its job. Now, I might be right or I might be wrong about this idea. You may think it's rubbish. But my proposal was simply that the FCA should trial it for a little while. Cost almost zero. Unfortunately, they were not open to this idea. A couple of weeks after this correspondence came to an end, it was all over the press. In fact, some of the trade press, I think Money Marketing may have run it. They spent £46,000 creating a spoof Christmas jingle that hardly anybody ever watched, and it costs £2 per viewing because so few people watched it. And it was also dealing with a type of scam that barely exists at all, which is where people are expected to pay some money up front in order to have the possibility of being loaned some money in the future. You know, nobody's saying we'll do that. So that was one tiny example of trying to encourage the FCA to be open-minded and try doing something different. And it went nowhere. So I complained to the FCA and it said, not interested, you know, we think what we've got is brilliant. And then I have now escalated it to the Complaints Commissioner. On past form, it'll take about 3 months to get a reply from her. It took about 8 months to get a reply from the FCA. So if we're really lucky, by the first anniversary of me having started to escalate the matter after the FCA said no, we might possibly get some kind of feedback.
I can just to briefly add to this with a general point. There are several areas where the Transparency Task Force is literally having to work very, very hard to try to get the FCA to do things that are almost definitely going to help. It is unbelievably frustrating. Quick example, there's loads of advertising out on the internet and elsewhere with misleading retail foreign exchange. We've been working with the FCA for 2 years to try to get this matter seriously. But they just won't. It's a cultural thing. I don't know what it is, but if it's ideas from outside the FCA, they just don't seem to like it. Let's go to any other comments and questions from the journalists, please. Please raise your hand, either digitally or otherwise. I see Susan Kramer has raised her hand. Susan, back to you.
Oh well,
and then we'll go to Ruby Henchcliffe. Thank you, Susan. Thank you.
I'm obviously not a journalist, but I just thought if we've got journalists that here who can do some investigation, we can't. My concern about both the people who, when you contact the FCA and you send in a complaint, or if you're a whistleblower and you go in and they treat the two, by the way, as entirely different. They treat whistleblowers as very different from complaints, so the systems are not linked up. But my sense from the conversations I've had with them is the people that they train are the kind of people you put on a complaints line in a course system. I think it's like 6 weeks training, and they're taught to be very compassionate to the people who call in, because undoubtedly they're people who are somewhat disturbed and have been through some bad experiences and need to be given a lot of sympathy. I contrast this to the United States, where when you make contact with the regulator, the attitude is, my God, are we getting some early information that we can use to try and track down a scam or pick up some early, a very early heads up on criminal activity, or we can stop a scandal or whatever else. And they have very senior investigators engaged with that information flow very quickly. But it's a completely different mentality that the FCA, most people who call in are troubled individuals who need to be calmed down, preferably encouraged to go away. That there's nobody with financial background to spot that there's potential problem here, or to track what's going on. Now, I can't prove that, but I suspect that work by an investigative journalist could probably get to the bottom of that pretty quickly. It's a huge cultural difference.
Wow, what a powerful point. Thank you very much indeed, Susan. Thank you so, so much. Let us jump now to Ruby. Ruby. Been itching to say that all day. Ruby, over to you.
Thanks, Andy. Yeah, just echoing what everyone else has said, it's been a really enlightening 24 hours watching the documentary and then listening to what people have said today. I just had a question around, it's quite clear that there's a sort of flaw here in terms of there is no one available to deal with unregulated scams. In terms of, and that obviously doesn't fall in the FCA's power, it's the Treasury that sets the FCA's power. In terms of going forward, because the FCA obviously, they're already saying that they have a lot to deal with and they're overwhelmed. Do you think there needs to be a separate body to deal with unregulated scams? Because is there a risk that if the FCA was to open its scope, which I'm not sure it would do, that it would then not be able to cope with the amount of kind of scams that would then come within its remit. So I was just wondering, from a sort of practical point of view, whether you thought that maybe having a separate body to deal with unregulated scams would be a sort of more practical solution.
Ruby, thank you so much for a great question, a great point. I'll pick that one up if I may, just with some initial thoughts on that. Point number one, the reality is that if there is fraudulent activity taking place, as was so clear in the case of Blackmore Bond, it was obvious that there was fraud by misrepresentation. Why? Because if you're making a statement that the investment is guaranteed by the world's largest banks, that's obviously fraudulent. If you're misdescribing the product, there's fraud by misrepresentation, which effectively brings it into the perimeter. And Paul Carlier can explain that in much more detail than I possibly can. So think about it in this way, Ruby. If there's fraudulent activity taking place, it actually is effectively inside the FCA's perimeter. The second point you raised about resources, the FCA's got so much to do. This drives us nuts because the FCA repeatedly say various committees, such as the Treasury Select Committee, they don't have a resource problem. They have enough resource. And there's nothing stopping them from raising the levy if they wanted to give themselves more resource. So we don't think the FCA saying we don't have enough resource to do our job properly is a legitimate position for them to take. Next point, they have taken on board all kinds of things that they don't have to. For example, and it was a massive strategic mistake, we think, Ruby, they basically got the Advertising Standards Authority to let go of the management of misleading advertising in retail foreign exchange. They didn't have to do that. So it's almost as if the FCA is sucking into itself all kinds of responsibilities that it doesn't need to take. And as a consequence, it's stretching itself really thin. And you really have to question whether the use of its own money, 2 examples, is wise. Number one, why have they been spending so much money on massive bonuses? Regulators at the top level are earning hundreds of thousands of pounds a year, and it's just completely inconsistent with the rest of the market. It doesn't really make sense. That's one misuse of money. Another really good one I'd like to suggest, the FCA spent about £7 million getting John Swift QC to provide a report about the interest rate hedging product mis-selling. The central finding of that report was, yes, the FCA should actually make the banks pay compensation. And what did the FCA do with the central finding that they spent £7 million on? They completely ignored it. Net result, an APPG is now having to take the FCA to court by way of a judicial review to try to get justice for those banking victims. There's all sorts of questions in that. There really is. Really is. Thank you, Ruby. Let's go to anybody else. Thank you. Who'd like to ask the next question if you'd like to? Thank you. We're going to go to, well, I can see we've got Mark and Paul and Susan with their hands up. Does anybody else have anything they'd like to say or ask at this stage? In which case, let's go back to Susan. Susan, I think your hand's still up.
Yeah, mine just very quickly. I just wanted to come back on the last question, because don't take it as normal that there's a regulatory perimeter. So we are the only country, as far as I know, across the globe that has a regulatory perimeter. Otherwise, everywhere else, companies are regulated. Therefore, all their activities are regulated. So the regulatory perimeter, for example, with LCF, that's a part of their advertising was that they were a regulated company. Well, they were regulated for their regulatory activities. It's just they were engaged in a lot of activities which fell in beyond the perimeter in the unregulated sector. So people tend to think this must be a regulated company. Therefore, all its activities are regulated. It's a really serious issue. Again, if somebody's got some investigative journalist muscle and time behind them, so the consequences of using our regulatory perimeter and regulating activities rather than regulated companies, and the lack of clarity which is a consequence of that, might be a very interesting area to explore.
Thank you again, Susan. Thank you so much. Any other journalists with a question or a comment at this point? If not, we'll go to Mark Bishop, then Paul Carlier. Then let's go to Mr. Mark Bishop. Mark, back to you.
Okay, thank you, Andy. I'd just like to reply to points raised by Baroness Kramer and Ruby Hinchcliffe. So the first one was, I think Baroness Kramer talked about the difference in culture between, say, the SEC in America and the FCA in the UK. Absolutely. In the Connaught case, where I was one of the investors, I'm now running the action group and I sit on the Electorators Committee, there was a very significant whistleblower called George Patelis. And what's significant about George, not only in his role, but is the fact that he's an American. And he therefore has dealt with the SEC. And he will say, every time he's asked about it, when asked to talk about the FCA's response to his whistleblowing, which was really credible, he turned up with a report from BDO basically saying there has been essentially theft of client assets, and a lawyer's report. So he went in armed. Their response was, oh, well, we'll think about it, we'll let you know later. And they then put in to supposedly investigate 2 people who had links to the perpetrators. So that's the level of reaction. They allowed it to trade for nearly a year. So that's the level of kind of performance they had. And he said, if the SEC had heard what I had said to the FCA, they would have made me wear a wire. And he would have said, and if I'd have refused, they'd have said, we could prosecute you if you don't. So that's the big difference in culture. I don't know how you fix that. And our proposals don't deal with fixing it, but what I think they might do is create the economic and governance conditions that will lead to it being fixed over time. That's probably the best we can offer. The second one is the regulatory perimeter, and that is a fascinating issue, isn't it? Where does the regulatory perimeter lie? And one of the things I've noticed is that very often scams work by arbitraging what is inside and outside the regulatory perimeter. And that actually brings me to the question that Ruby Hinchcliffe asked, which is, who deals with unregulated scams? Well, I think the answer is, if those scams are outside of financial services, then in theory, you would report it to either your local police or action fraud. Action fraud tends to be known as inaction fraud because it doesn't do very much, but that's what you're supposed to do. But if it's in financial services, actually the correct answer is the FCA. And the reason why I say that is, and I'm no lawyer, but I've spent 10 years on this now and I've picked up most of the legislation. The regulatory perimeter is partly about firms. Is a firm authorised or not, or an individual? But it's also about activities. There are certain activities that in the UK, it is a criminal offence to conduct if you are not doing it within an authorised firm. So one of those is financial promotions. If you issue a financial promotion, either your firm must be authorised or a third-party firm that is authorised will have approved the promotion. If you just made it up yourself on your Mac and sent it out, then you are committing a criminal offence under financial promotions regime. So that's a matter for the FCA. Similarly, if you want to be a custodian of client assets, like a bank is a custodian of client assets or an asset manager is one. Similarly, those things require you to have not just be on the FCA register, but to hold the relevant permissions. So if there is a financial services scam going on, there are powers that belong to the FCA. Now, I'm glad that we have parliamentarians involved in this call. I know that some have now gone, but I'll make this point to the journalists that are on this call, and it's this. There was an interesting chronology of events that happened a year or 18 months ago. The first is that the Work and Pensions Committee ran an inquiry about pension scams. We gave evidence to it. And one of the pieces of evidence was me sending in a Freedom of Information request response from the FCA, which basically showed that they almost never prosecute people for financial promotions rule breaches. That was significant itself. Then one of the MPs asked the FCA about this. Why do you never prosecute people for financial promotions? And the response was, actually, that's because we prefer to prosecute for the underlying fraud. We do that a lot. This was Mark Stewart, the Enforcement Director, and I knew that wasn't the case. So I put in another Freedom of Information request. I got the data back. Most years, either one or no prosecutions for fraud. And so I give this information to Angela Eagle MP, Dame Angela Eagle. And she then asked in the Treasury Committee, why do you hardly ever prosecute for fraud? And Mark Stewart became almost enraged. And you can see it and you can read the transcript. And what he basically said was, we are not the lead prosecutor for fraud. It's nothing to do with us. Don't blame us. So actually, what are they doing? It may be the case that they should be prosecuting only on the things for which they're a lead prosecutor, and they should be working with the police on the other stuff. Personally, I don't care if the Blackmore Bond people go to jail for a long time for financial promotions and custodianship offences, but they don't go to jail fraud. I'm confident that fraud also happens. I would love it if they'd be prosecuted for both. But what we can't have is a situation where neither occurs. And one of the most insidious things of all about this perimeter is that just as a regulatory perimeter, there is also a law enforcement perimeter. What happens is this. A person goes to their local police and says, here's a financial scam. And the police say, we have a memorandum of understanding with the FCA. It requires us to notify them when there is an allegation of financial misconduct. And this is true. And you could say it's legitimate because actually there could be financial offences that should be prosecuted. So the police hand over the case to the FCA and it dies. Nothing ever happens. No point do the police get told, we're not going to do anything, you guys must. And of course, these are very expensive, complex cases, and the police frankly want to get rid of them. They want to land them at the FCA's desk. The FCA don't want to do anything with them for reasons we might speculate about. And that's why we end up with nothing being done.
Well, thank you very much indeed. You made that point brilliantly. You really, really did. Does anybody else have a comment or question? Lindsay Rogerson. Lindsay, lovely to have you with us. Please introduce yourself briefly, Lindsay, and put your point to us. Thank you.
Yes, thanks very much. Really enjoyed the Panorama programme. I just have a couple of, and obviously I will follow the Financial Services and Markets Bill's progress through Parliament and watch out for these points. It's just really a tidying up exercise about what is actually happening to the two individuals from the programme, because I noticed one of the things that the programme said was the Insolvency Service isn't taking any investigation, and from what you've said on this call earlier, it seems that the Insolvency Service should. And so I'm just wondering, what is actually happening to these two individuals? Are they just scot-free? And there was a mention of a property as well that one of them was selling. Why are there no freezing orders? I'm just really, it would just be helpful to know if there's anything that can be done with these two individuals. And then on the point about getting a judge-led review, what levers are you pulling to get that to happen? And would it be a Dame Gloucester type? So I can't remember the exact FCA regulations, but as you guys know, there's two. There's one where they appoint they set the terms, and then there's the other one which was the Dame Elizabeth type review. And so I'm just wondering what judge-led review you're hoping for. Thanks.
Thank you very much indeed, Lindsay. First of all, does anybody have a coherent answer to what's happening to the two chaps spoken about in the programme? Because I can't come up with a decent, sensible answer that doesn't sound stupid.
Can I go?
It seems to me not a lot. Yes, please, Paul. Thank you.
Yeah. So, well, basically, the transfer or referral or decision to have the Insolvency Service investigate this was the result of my report to Action Fraud. And where I dumped the evidence on them, it forced them, they couldn't fob me off with the NFIB response. So they responded, and it appears to be that a decision was taken between the FCA, City of London Police and the Insolvency Service to divert it to the Insolvency Service. They wouldn't give me the name of the person there who was investigating, but I found out from a source from another case, who the person was, the case file, contacted them, gave them all my evidence, said I had a lot more, be happy to discuss further. They never got back to me. I do understand that they reached out to others, but this was news to us that they had made a decision not to take action, specifically because we understand as well that in the first 3 months after the liquidators went in, they raised serious concerns with the Insolvency Service as well. So you have the concerns from the liquidators, all the evidence that I gave them and others gave them. And, you have here, money was, the program showed 2 million went offshore. Well, hang on, to another company owned by them. Well, is that not, that has to be a breach of law somewhere, and certainly, and perhaps tax law. What do HMRC know about that? But we don't know. I'm written to the Insolvency Service, asking them and City of London Police, okay, since you've now said that it appears the Insolvency Service isn't doing anything, can you tell me if City of London Police or the FCA are going to pick that up and run with it now that avenue appears to be exhausted? I do suspect there's a I raised concerns with the FCA about this, that there appeared to be a concerning suppression of any evidence that might suggest fraud or criminality, and the reason being that there's this insurance policy that was obtained in Costa Rica won't pay out if there's any evidence of fraud by directors. The other exemption is that it won't pay out if the portfolio wasn't sufficiently diversified. So you take your pick, it ain't paying out for either of those reasons, but that appears to be efforts have been taken to suppress any allegation of fraud by any kind of formal body, and the insolvency service taking no action despite this overwhelming evidence is a matter of concern. But I am following it up to see what is being done now.
I mean, we contacted the insolvency service as part of the programme because it was really unhelpful that they hadn't taken any action against Nana McCreesh. McCreesh was using it in his right to reply process to make it, make out he had done nothing wrong. And they went as far as saying that their inquiries potentially could be reopened, and these guys hadn't been found not responsible. I think the bottom line is they don't have enough resources and have simply failed to take action because they don't have the resources to do so. I mean, I think their efforts were feeble, frankly. And I mean, as you know, the programme was largely about the fact that nobody seems to be taking action. Lindsay, it's a good question. We've been asking ourselves all the way along, how on earth has nobody taken action against these guys?
And we'll come to your second part of your question in a second, Lindsay. There are parallels here. There are other people whose names I could name, but I won't, who are believed to have been responsible for pension scams going back 10, 11 years, who've been consistently robbing people of their retirement savings, who've just not been properly investigated. It isn't just Nana McCreesh that seem to have this ability to, I don't know, run rings around the regulators. What's the problem? I just don't know. But Lindsay, in terms of the type of inquiry, just before I respond to that specific point, there's a real risk that if the FCA can, they'll use the creation of an inquiry as a stalling tactic for not actually doing anything. Our first wish, if you like, is that the victims of Blackmore Bond and all the other similar chronic and catastrophic regulatory cases get compensation and justice quickly. The FCA seem to have a bit of a habit with inquiries. They use them to kick things into long grass. For example, Woodford, there's hundreds of thousands of people who've lost life-changing amounts of money waiting for the FCA to produce a report on that. And it just hasn't been done. So we're quite nervous about the ability of the FCA to use reviews and investigations as a means to basically become a war of attrition. In terms of which approach would be best, for me, that's something that really would come down to whatever the parliamentarians' thoughts. And I'd like the idea of having one flank of activity, which is all about let's have an inquiry and an investigation. That's one flank of activity, but parallel to that, let's do the obvious thing. There's clearly been a chronic and catastrophic breakdown of regulation here. The evidence Paul has provided shows that the FCA knew after an internal investigation that took a bloke, I think, about a year, Paul, is that right? They knew that they dropped the ball. They knew that they missed the opportunity. And as a consequence, lots and lots of people were scammed that simply should not have been. But thanks, Lindsay. Does anybody else have anything they want to come in on that? Yes, I think Mark does. Go for it, Mark.
Yeah, thank you, Andy. I just want to respond to some of the points that have been raised. The first one is about the inquiry. I absolutely agree with you that the problem of shouting too loud and too soon about an inquiry is that we might get it. And then the FCA will say, well, all of these other things that you're proposing, they're interesting, but we should see what the result is of the inquiry. And we also would be creating an incentive for them to take even longer with their enforcement investigation, such as we suspect it is. So I think we should be saying, put down a marker, as happened in the programme. There will have to be one. There will have to be one. But deal with the urgent stuff first. I think that's a good way forward. And of the two types...
Sorry, can I interrupt there? Surely you go hard for an inquiry.
No, let me explain to you the reasons why, and I say this as somebody who
I know the reasons. I just don't think that that's right, because you've got a big example of failure by the FCA, surely that then motivates the other action.
Oh yes, yeah. But the problem is this: what we've got is a well-founded allegation of failure by the FCA, and if we go down the route of calling for an inquiry, and if that's all we do, then we'll spend some time arguing about whether there should be one, and eventually we may win. And what the FCA will first say is, we cannot possibly start this inquiry until it has finished, until we've finished all enforcement investigations. So it won't start for a couple of years, probably, maybe more. The second thing is, they'll do what they've done with all of these other inquiries, and they will say, we will set up a board subcommittee that will decide who conducts the review, set the terms of reference, set the protocols, and they will also set themselves up as the sole provider of data and the conduit through which the person conducting the inquiry can get access to current and former employees. Those employees will also be given a legal briefing that says you don't have to say anything that might incriminate yourself, and they will be given one-to-one legal support throughout the process. Now, you could say as an employer they should be doing those things, they have a duty of care, but you could also be saying that what they're doing is signalling, please don't drop us in it. They will take a couple of years to carry out the inquiry, and they will give themselves maximalisation rights. So if we were really lucky, in 5 years' time, we might see a report that gives us a little bit of what we hoped would be in it. And that's not a bad thing, and it's needed, absolutely is needed, but it's not the only thing needed. And the problem of calling for it too loud at this point is that it could drown out the other messages, which is, this is the latest in a huge queue of these scandals. £1 billion a year being lost by hardworking citizens, and there is now a real opportunity to amend the Financial Services and Markets Bill. So maybe in 6 months' time we'll want to make a lot of noise about an independent review, but at the moment tactically we're going in a slightly different direction. So that's the business about the inquiry. The second is about the Insolvency Service. I think that Paul's speculation is probably right. I know the insolvency practitioners involved. In fact, I introduced them. They're one of the few groups that I would actually trust to do a decent job, and I've known them for 10 years. And I believe that what they are probably doing at the moment is doing their best to exhaust all options with the insurance policy. I think most of us are pretty confident it won't pay out, but at the moment it may not help them for the directors to have been found to have been comporting themselves inappropriately by the Insolvency Service. I do know how they've acted in previous cases, and I feel sure that they will do as they're expected to do by law and submit a confidential report to the Insolvency Service about the actions of the directors, and I would be astounded if the result is not a lengthy ban for those individuals. But I would also say that there have been plenty of people who have been banned by the Insolvency Service and have gone on to conduct further financial services frauds and even to be authorised by the FCA and appearing on their register. The third thing was, what are Nunn and McCreesh up to now? I don't know what McCreesh is up to now, but I do know that Philip Nunn has rebranded himself Philip New, NU, for some bizarre reason, and he is now running a cryptocurrency scam. So that one of the big messages that really I want to get across is most financial scammers are serial entrepreneurs. They do one financial scam, a small one, and they may be a small player within it, and they see that you can get away with it. Next time they do a bigger one, and they are probably the leader of it, and then they go to one even bigger. So I predict that in 3, 4, 5 years' time, we will be holding another of these symposiums when the victims of what this, I forgot its name, but McCreesh's, Nunn's cryptocurrency scam, when those people have all realised that their money is gone.
Thank you, Mark. We need to start bringing things to a close. Does anybody have any urgent comments or questions before we wrap the session up? Agathangelou, so could you get your point across as succinctly as possible, please? Thank you.
Yeah, just a very quick one, since we have the parliamentarians also in the House to mention. When a new product is being introduced or is being dissolved, like the pension freedoms in 2015, I think the government did not do due care when it comes to looking at how people could be vulnerable with this kind of funds. We need to bear in mind that, knowing fully well that these kind of funds are people's life savings, and it's a lot of money, which most people in this category wouldn't have managed during their they're lifetime saving. I think from that point of view, the government also has certain look back to do when either implementing new products or new strategy, or dissolving the existing product or strategy to have a very robust care. And we have events in the past that have shown us that these products are very vulnerable. The credit card introduction is one that everyone was vulnerable when it was introduced, and I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
I think you make a great point. You know, really, there ought to be a requirement to make sure products are not toxic before they're allowed to be introduced to the market. Some countries do that. You need a license to be able to introduce a product to the market. The product itself has to meet certain criteria before it's allowed to be sold. I get your point entirely. Anybody else for anything else that's you're itching to say before we wrap the session up? It looks like we're all good. That session went a lot longer than we had. Oh, forgive me, Paul. Quick point from you. Thank you, Paul.
I just want to make a couple of very quick points on Ruby's question. That, you know, firstly, you know, we have to remember that existing rules are already very significant in many respects, but the FCA and other regulators tend to cherry pick when to apply them. So, and as we've actually heard from actual FCA whistleblowers themselves, that the tendency is the FCA assesses a case that comes through the door on the basis of, first of all, how exposed are we? And that is the determination that it uses before deciding whether or not to investigate. The other issue about resources, the FCA bemoans the lack of resources to the nth degree and constantly rolls it out. However, at every turn, it consistently refuses to engage with myself and countless other professionals, and including regulated IFAs and whistleblowers, you know, on any report that we make or any engagement we seek. And that is denying itself access to an incredible resource of experience and intelligence, and that it would pay nothing for. You know, so how do you, one doesn't square with the other. And let's not forget that in terms of unregulated business, the FCA has said that it should be, and confirms that it is, but apparently doesn't appear to be, diverting the intelligence and the reporter to the relevant body or agency. So, you know, it means that essentially there's a framework or system there that should cover all this. The fact it isn't is more about concealment and, you know, reputational risks that the FCA or the regulators perceive than too many gaps within the law or regulation that exists.
Well, thank you very much. Let's bring the session to a close. That's the first time we've run an event like this, folks. I hope it worked for you. It certainly worked for me. I found it very, very interesting, and I learned a lot. I really did. Thank you again to everybody that had something to do with the programme. Of course, Luke and his team at 9 Lives Media, all the BBC Panorama people, Paul and James Stevens, John Robbins, Paul Carlier, Mahendra Bajaj, and everybody else involved. From our point of view, as a campaigning organisation, you know, the history is split into two. You know, not BC and AD, but pre-Panorama and post-Panorama. We're into a whole new era now. It's the post-Panorama era. What could parliamentarians do now? That's the question that we'll continue to discuss and debate as the days, weeks and months roll ahead. Thank you all very, very much. Luke, final point. Go on.
I just want to say thank you to you as well, Andy, because you did so much for our programme. I mean, no, seriously, to get the symposium, the protest. I think you worked with Susan and Martin and others to arrange the meeting for our investors to go and meet them. Amazing. Absolutely.
Thank you, Luke. You're very, very kind to say
Mark,
so.
you're involved in that as well, so, you know, amazing stuff.
It's all a great big team effort, and we believe in what we're doing. I hope it generally comes across. We really do believe in what we're doing. We think it's damn important, and we'll carry on doing the best that we can. Thanks all very, very much indeed. Thank you. Super stuff. Have a good rest of your day.